This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what are we giving thanks for this week?
We are giving thanks for the fact that America is prosperous and American greatness is coming back despite the fact that our population and the global population is beginning to plummet. We are heading towards, as our friend Nick Eberstadt has pointed out, for the first time since the Black Death in the 1300s, the world is heading for an era of depopulation. And this time, for the first time, it's happening not because of some sort of catastrophe like a plague or that, where it's being driven by choices that people are making. People are choosing not to have children. And, you know, it's interesting because we're going into depopulation. There's this new trend on the left. When we don't get into this sort of conversation with Nick Eberstadt, who's our guest today, but we probably should have. There's this new trend on the left calling for degrowth. Right? That, you know, economic growth, we've always taken it as a net positive, right? Growing economy, more jobs, more opportunity, more wealth, more prosperity. And some people on the left are saying maybe we should go into an era of degrowth because the climate is going to destroy the planet and, you know, growth ain't so good. And the choices people are making in terms of fertility, having children, may lead us to degrowth.
Yeah, you know, look, I mean, that's true. I think it's really hard for people to imagine just what a world with fewer people looks like. You know, there is this mythology and I don't want to pile only on the left because there are plenty of these problems on the right as well, but there's certainly this mythology propagated in the extremist environmental movement, for example, that we can turn back time. Right? So we can go back to not having 7 children and 5 of them dying in childbirth, which is what was the case 200 years ago, or it was the case in Russia 70 years ago, but that we can go back to the moral equivalent of that time by merely having fewer children. And the answer to that is no, we can't, because we have constructed society based on families, based on work, and based on social safety nets that are dependent upon these cycles. And if you want to know what this looks like when it goes south, you shouldn't look to the heyday of the 1860s or whatever it is that Al Gore thinks is the heyday or Greta Thunberg thinks is the heyday. Maybe it's 10,000 years ago. But you should look at China. Because China, as our guest Nick Eberstadt has written beautifully, is now this inverted pyramid where the tiny, tiny cohort of births is sustaining a vast and growing elderly population that will at a certain moment not be able to work, will, if they are in America, probably at a certain moment get cancer or Alzheimer's or dementia and require the support of their family or society. And if society can't pay for it and the family isn't there, you are going to start, seeing people putting old people on ice floes floating out to sea like the Eskimos do. And that's not going to be a pretty picture for poor old Greta Thunberg's parents.
Well, Canada's already doing that, which we've talked about the medical assistance in dying in other podcasts. But, you know, as people become a burden on society, we're going to have to lift the burden in some way.
Right. Death panels, socialized that's exactly right. That the outcome is not that we all go back to the heyday where we didn't have phones and didn't have engines and didn't have trains or ships or printers or whatever. The idea is that we go back to a time when healthcare simply chooses not to address your problem and allows you to die.
Well, what's interesting about it is so we are going through depopulation, and so there are going to be fewer and fewer young people, working people to support the older people who can no longer work. But because of advances in healthcare and in the longevity is going to increase, and so those older people are going to be living longer and longer and needing support longer and longer. And we're getting into this vicious cycle now where you've got these younger people who want socialism, want the growing welfare state, but are not producing the taxpayers to support it. And so you're not going to be able to, the whole welfare state model that we have now is going to go away. Because if you don't have enough workers putting into the pot and you have more and more aging population taking out of the pot, then that's unsustainable over time. So if you believe in a social safety net, or even worse, if you believe in like government running every aspect of your lives and supporting all your lives, wherever you are on that spectrum, none of it's going to be sustainable over time, because we're not going to have the population to do it. And the other thing, think about the problems we're having right now. Inflation, which everyone is grappling with today. Inflation over time may become absolutely endemic, because if you're going through depopulation, that means fewer workers, and means rising wages, means rising costs. Right? So everything's going to cost more because the demand for workers will not be met, and we have to pay people more to produce the things we want. And so we're going to have lots and lots of inflation as well. There's so many different implications for this that are going to absolutely fundamentally transform our society. And by the way, it's not a problem that's going to be down the line. So for a future generation to worry about, as Nick points out in his foreign affairs essay, which we're going to talk about with him in a moment, this is all going to happen in the lifetimes of people living today. This whole societal transformation.
No, that's exactly right. And, for some reason, there are people who believe that if we just tax the rich more, then we will be able to pay for this and to sustain this unequal, ridiculous social safety net utopia that people think is in Sweden, but actually isn't. So it's funny, I caught over the weekend this article. In 2022, Norway increased its wealth tax to 1.1%. It was expected to bring in a revenue of $146 million annually. Instead, individuals with a net worth of $54 billion left the country, leading to a $594 million loss in tax revenue. Oh, and by the way, that's not in some conservative journal. That's in a report coming out of the European Union as a kind of a word to the wise. So yeah, taxing successful people is not going to be the answer either. It is remarkable how ill thought through all of these utopians' idea about what the future looks like really is.
And the other thing that's interesting about this, another way to think about this, is we always tell our kids, start saving for retirement early, right? Open that IRA right away, because if you just look at it, the more you put away now, thanks to the rule of 72 and the magic of compound interest, every year you put it off, you'll have less wealth to retire on and all the rest of it. There's also, and many young people don't listen to that, right? They say, well, I'll have Social Security and, the world, everything will take care of itself because the future seems infinite and I'm enjoying my life right now. I'd rather take that vacation or, go to that concert or do something, use my money in other ways. Well, it's sort of the same with children. Children are an investment in your future, because guess what? When you're old and you can't take care of yourself, or when you can't work anymore, who's going to love you? It's not going to be the people you were going to the concert with when you were in your 20s. Though in our case, it probably will be. We'll be still going to concerts together when we're 80 and 90. But for most people, it's going to be, it's not the people you went on vacation with in your 20s and like traveled around the world with when you were backpacking in your 20s. It's going to be your kids.
No.
It's going to, and there's going to be not just an economic crisis down the road when this happens. There's going to be if you think there's a loneliness epidemic going on right now, the loneliness epidemic is going to be exponential. And oh, by the way, if you only have one kid, you're going to have one kid to take care of you if they live, and some people, their kids predecease them and you might have nobody. And the burden on those kids is going to be enormous because it's really hard to take care of an aging parent. You need a whole family to do that. So, there's so many implications of this. And also the other implication we got to talk about is, one of the things we talked about in a previous podcast is that Donald Trump, for all of his opposition to illegal immigration, is actually a supporter of legal immigration. And guess what? The only thing that's going to save us from this demographic collapse is legal immigration, because we happen to be the lucky country that everybody wants to come to. And if we want workers to come in and provide tax revenue and work and provide all these services for us, if we're not producing them, we got to import them. And
That's
we're going to
exactly
need
right.
more and more immigrants. And so there's going to be a global, right now we're overwhelmed by illegal migrants who are trying to come here. Down the road a few decades, we're going to be competing for them with other countries. There's going to be a global competition for migration. And I think we're lucky that we're still the country people want to come to, but that could change. So we need to really think about immigration as really the legal immigration may be what saves us from ourselves.
I hope that that's true. I think it's actually an unbelievably optimistic way to think about it. Hey, we keep telling you Nick's with us, so we might as well introduce Nick. Nicholas Eberstadt is the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researches demographics, economic development, international security in the Korean Peninsula, and Asia. He's the senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research, a founding board member of the U.S. Committee on Human Rights in North Korea, and he serves as a consultant or advisor to the U.S. government and a variety of international organizations. His most recent book is the post-pandemic edition of Men Without Work.
Here's our interview. Well, Nick, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, it's a delight to be invited back. Thank you for this.
We love having you. So you've written a fantastic essay in Foreign Affairs in which you point out that for the first time since the Black Death in the 1300s, the world is heading into an era of depopulation. And I think it may be, if I read you correctly, the first time that it's been by choice. Is that correct? And to explain to us what the hell is going on.
Well, we know that human numbers in total have dropped before in the past, but within historical memory, it's always been due to calamity. It's been due to mortality crises, either caused by famines or the rest of the horsemen of the apocalypse. What's on the horizon now is a first for our species, which would be a long-term shrinking of human numbers in a non-catastrophic fashion, not caused by mortality crises. We expect that orderly material advance is going to be continuing. Health is going to be continuing to improve. It's because of choices that people all over the world are making about their family size, choosing to have such a small number of children that population wouldn't replace itself.
So, Nick, first of all, thank you for the absolutely great essay in Foreign Affairs. I knew it would be a blockbuster when you showed it to me, and it's the kind of work that AEI does best and that you do best. So I'm really grateful for it.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the details. But I mean, obviously, I think a lot of our listeners and we are very interested in the why and in the implications. But let's first talk about the details of what's happening. The last time this happened was the Black Death. And now what's going on? And is this unexpected?
Well, the obviously good news is that all around the planet, life expectancy is getting longer and longer. Death rates are getting lower and lower. Health is getting better and better. The life expectancy at birth has more than doubled since the beginning of the 20th century. And there's no sign that trend is going to stop. What's astonishing is the rapid spread of what we might call sub-replacement fertility, of childbearing patterns, say 2 or fewer children, becoming kind of the norm in places you just wouldn't have expected. And you don't hear much about it because this isn't like an asteroid strike. This isn't like sudden news. It's quiet, and it's on the basis of hundreds of millions of decisions that prospective parents are making. So just to give you an example, Calcutta, which I first visited about 50 years ago. Calcutta now is a place where an average of 1 birth per woman per lifetime prevails. I mean, it's lower than Europe, it's lower than North America, it's even lower than Japan. Or you go to Bogota, less than 1 birth per woman per lifetime. Mexico City is now reporting less than 1 birth per woman per lifetime. Mexico's birth level last year was lower than the U.S. birth level, for the first time since people have started collecting these numbers. You see this pattern not just in East Asia, but in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Strangely, in parts of the Ummah in the Middle East as well, throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, in places that account for 2/3 or 3/4 of the world's population today.
I want to follow up about this because I understand this as a first world phenomenon, right? You understand why the wokerati of America don't want to burden the climate any further. And ditto for Europe, right? You can sort of see the arguments there, and you can also see the rise of a welfare state that creates dependencies that preclude having children and certainly preclude having children at a young age. What I don't understand is the other places you mentioned, right? Calcutta. But if you remember years back, we talked also about the precipitous fall in birth rates in Tehran, in Iran, right? In Iran, people are not worried about burdening the climate. They are not, Harry and Meghan Markle saying they'll only have 2 children to virtue signal. How do you explain the regional anomalies?
It's happening in all sorts of places that have no apparent connection to each other. And all sorts of places that are not OECD rich, affluent, democracies. The extreme cases are, in a way, the most fascinating. So Nepal and Burma, Myanmar, are both on the UN's list of least developed countries, fragile states, impoverished populations, widespread illiteracy, rural life for many. They're also both now sub-replacement fertility countries. They both are places where the average level of childbearing isn't high enough to sustain long-term population stability. So whatever is going on is coming in a lot of different varieties in different places in the world, that it seems to be encouraging local parents to embrace radically different ideas about family life from the ones that their parents had or their grandparents or previous traditions. But it's happening almost everywhere at the moment except in the sub-Sahara and a few Muslim majority countries.
So interestingly, our colleagues over at Brookings put out a report a few years ago that in September 2018, for the first time in human history, the majority of people were either middle class or rich rather than poor or on the verge of poverty by global, not by American standards of wealth and but by global standards, which was the first time that's ever happened since the rise of agricultural civilization. Does that maybe have an effect? Because what we consider to be undeveloped by the standards of some of these countries, they've become much more developed and much more prosperous and less on the verge of poverty. Could this be happening? It seems like there's a pattern of, in the more prosperous you are, there's, by relative standards, the fewer children you have, when in fact, if the more prosperous you have, the more children you can support. It should be the opposite. Why might that be?
Well, Mark, you're surely right that the world is richer than it's ever been. It's healthier than it's ever been before. It's more educated than it's ever been before. It's more urban than it's ever been before. And all of those tendencies we associate with smaller family size. So to the extent that those drivers are affecting taste for children, let's say, desire for children, we've got pressures that would be bringing lower family size as a norm all around the world. But the fascinating thing here, though, is the exceptions. At the same time that the world is getting richer, better educated, better fed, the threshold for below replacement childbearing patterns is dropping all around the world. We're seeing new examples of low-income countries where education hasn't made much inroads, where there a fair amount of illiteracy, rural populations, impoverished populations, where birth rates are dropping or plummeting as well. And and this takes us back to kind of like the very beginning of of what became the march to below replacement fertility around the world. The non-catastrophic drops in birth rates began in Europe in the 18th century. But they didn't start in England. They did not start in the most advanced, developed country in Europe. They started in France, which was a lot poorer than the UK, less educated, more rural, impoverished, and not to put too fine a point on it, Catholic. So even from the very beginning, whatever it was that was driving this march to smaller families was in effect.
So you mentioned that France was Catholic, but yeah, I've been to a church in France in recent years and it's pretty doggone empty. You said that one of the exceptions is some of the Muslim majority countries. And I'd be interested in, do you think that the increasing secularization of the world has a role in this? And, for example, are Muslims in Europe below replacement compared to the secular Western populations? What role is religion having in all of this?
I can't prove this because there are a lot of places where they don't collect data on religion. I mean, it's illegal for the Census Bureau to collect data on the faiths that people profess in the U.S. and other places too like that. Yeah. But so it's clear that in a lot of Muslim majority countries, below replacement fertility is now the norm. Dan, you mentioned Iran already. Turkey, I think Ankara's birth level is lower than Copenhagen's at this point. Lebanon, to the extent that it's Muslim population. Tunisia, there are other places as well. They're all below replacement in the Muslim majority world. And the birth rates have been plunging throughout the Ummah. The fastest drops in birth rates in the post-war era have mainly been in Muslim majority countries. And that's not because they're socioeconomic modernizers like Taiwan. Something else is happening. And in Europe, it's a very mixed bag, Mark. The immigrants from Muslim majority countries who seem to be assimilating the best, and I'm thinking of people like from Indonesia in the Netherlands, their birth levels are indistinguishable from native Hollanders. In places where they're not fitting in as well, and I'm thinking of people like from Pakistan in the UK, there's still big differences in birth rates.
So the one thing that occurs to me, and forgive me, I don't think you mentioned this, but you may have, and I may have also asked you, and I'm getting senile. But one thing that I do wonder is, because this is a universal, is whether cell phones are a factor. I mean, certainly if we extrapolate from conversations that Mark and I have had about what people call not Gen Z, but Gen I, right? The iPhone generation. Those people are having a lot less sex. They're having a lot less dating. They're having a lot less interaction with other humans. And one of the most remarkable things to me about India is that it doesn't matter whether you're literate or illiterate. You are still addicted to your iPhone. So is that a factor?
Addiction is the word, isn't it? Addiction. Uh,
Yeah.
I cannot prove this, but I wonder exactly the same thing. Because if you look at the spread of the smartphones around the world, and they are almost everywhere now, the overwhelming majority of adults on this planet have got some version of a smartphone. But if you look at the saturation, it's got a really fascinating correspondence to this acceleration of the drop in the birth rate. It makes me wonder whether we aren't seeing some sort of strange new version of the Narcissus gaze, looking through the other side of the screen. And I can't prove it, but I can tell you we've never had as many people in the world, and there's so much loneliness, right? And I think the smartphone is part of this loneliness epidemic, too.
And it's only going to get worse as people age without children or with very few children because they're going to die old and alone. It's a terrible. But let's talk a little bit about the consequences. So you've pointed out that the result of this is going to be fewer workers, fewer savers, fewer taxpayers, fewer renters, fewer home buyers, fewer entrepreneurs, fewer innovators, fewer inventions, and eventually fewer consumers. How are we going to maintain economic growth? How are we going to maintain the growing welfare state that we are creating? It seems like this Gen I, Gen Z, they want socialism, but they don't want to produce the taxpayers to pay for it.
Everything is going to change. All of the things that are familiar to us about social arrangements and economic arrangements, maybe even political arrangements, kind of presuppose as elevator music, the idea that there could be more of us. And within lifetimes, within existing lifetimes, that's all going to flip around. And so there's going to have to be a massive relearning and an absolutely pervasive set of adaptations to a new world where smaller and older is the new norm. Now, I'm not as frightened about this as some who describe this prospect, because I lived through the population explosion. And you know, the things that people wrote, the apocalyptic things that people wrote about what was going to happen as human beings kind of like locust the world, are wildly off the mark. And one of the great doomsayers was a professor at Stanford named Paul Ehrlich. I mean, he's a tenured professor in population biology, so you'd think he might know what he was talking about, and he did. But what he knew about was the biology of insects. If we were insects, his prophecies would have come true, but we're humans, and humans are the most inventive and adaptable of the species on the planet, which is why I'm tolerably confident that we're going to be able to adapt to this too. We won't be able to keep the pay-as-you-go welfare state. That's going to be a doom loop when there are fewer earners than recipients. But as long as we continue to increase our productivity, our health, our knowledge, I think we're going to be able to maintain and improve wealth and prosperity even in a shrinking, aging world.
So one of the things that's fascinating is obviously the exception here, and the exception remains in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the only part of the world that's growing. And I would love to hear your theories about why that is. But I particularly liked something that you said, because I thought it was just fascinating. You said that, but do not confuse the fact that this is where birth rates remain above replacement with the fact that there is going to be an African century ahead. Right? You said in a world where per capita output varies by as much as a factor of 100, human capital will still matter greatly to national power, and the outlook for human capital in sub-Saharan Africa remains disappointing. Talk about the why and then that fact, which is
Sure.
fascinating.
Well, what's happening in Africa is what's happening everywhere else. It's just a little bit more delayed. I mean, we now see Republic of South Africa down to replacement level. It looks like it's on a path to be the first continental sub-Saharan sub-replacement country. There are places like Cape Verde and Mauritius off the coast, which are already below replacement. It looks as if the rest of the subcontinent is on the same path. It's just going to get there after some of the other parts of the world. And what that may mean is that their population may double between now and when this starts to happen. Okay. What is shocking to read about in the studies that people have done on international standardized test scores is how very low and very consistently low the level of knowledge and skills is for young people in the sub-Sahara. One of our sometime AEI colleagues, Stanford professor Rick Hanashek, did a study earlier this year looking at the global patterns. He and his colleagues say that almost 95% of young people in the sub-Sahara do not meet even level 1 out of 5 of basic skills. In other words, can't tell time looking at a non-digital clock, can't add 3 columns. It's not just sub-Sahara. There's a lot of that in India, Pakistan, some other places in the world as well. But as long as that is the case, the economic potential of the region isn't going to be achieved. I mean, you can make the argument that the most important thing one might do for the planet's prosperity would be to kind of encourage knowledge and skills in the sub-Sahara. You can't do that with a magic wand. You need governance, you need institutions, but it's a big, important part of the human deficit at the moment.
So let me bring it back home a little bit in terms of how this will play out here in the United States. So will AI save us? I mean, right now it seems like the concern is that AI is going to come in and take all of our jobs. But if we're not producing workers, then will AI be able to do the jobs that these missing workers would have done and help us maintain our prosperity with a lower population?
Mark, it's a terribly important question, and I don't know the answer to that. AI is so new that I'm not sure that we know what it's going to be good for. I mean, and it's still evolving very rapidly. I mean, if I look at it through a kind of an economic history lens, and I think of it as as another technological innovation, as another form of
The new Gutenberg
yeah,
press.
yeah, exactly. You could say that in the past, people who had skills were able to harness the new technology and multiply their incomes. People who couldn't harness the new technology get displaced. I mean, working on that old-fashioned, view, you'd worry that it would be possible to have shrinking populations that would also have a lot of people displaced. The solution there, I think, is to try to push for education and skills so that we can get rich as fast as possible to help us cope with all of the adjustment pains that we surely are going to have in a depopulating world.
So you and I have talked about this before, but I think our listeners will be interested in the question of pro-natalist policies. It's one of the greatest ironies I know for you and for those of us who watch the People's Republic of China, to watch them not simply reverse their evil one-child policy, but to embrace a pro-natalist policy in which Chinese people have to have more than one child, and of course to see it fail miserably. But before them came the French and others, and I remember at the time I asked you, does this work? And you said there's no data to show it ever works. Is that still the truth? And why not?
Well, it's possible to force people to have fewer children with bayonets and police power. I don't think we've figured out how to force them to have more children with bayonets and police power. And we haven't figured out how to bribe them into having more kids than they want to have either. Maybe because we're not willing to offer 50% of the GDP as, opportunity cost or whatever. What we've seen pretty much everywhere that baby bonuses or baby bribes have been tried is that there's a temporary small increase in births. And it turns out that this is just basically kind of a timing thing, that people who are kind of on the fence about having a second or third kid take the money and run. And then after that, the birth rate drops down to below where it was before. I don't think we're going to have a successful pronatal policy until we have a policy that changes people's mentality, either through religious revival, ideological, political. And that's a kind of a spooky idea for government intrusion.
So, one of the reasons why America might be okay in this depopulating world is that we are the world's premier destination of migrants, of legal migrants. People want to come here, people want to be Americans, people want to live in America. Countries that will attract population will do better than those who are losing them. But we're about to engage in a mass deportation campaign here in the United States of all these illegal migrants that came in. Not too long from now, we're going to be entering into a global competition for migrants in order to keep our economy going. How does immigration play into all of this?
Well, Mark, as you know, the myth that we're a nation of immigrants has a basis in truth, like so many myths do. And we've been fantastically successful at attracting talent from all over the world. I mean, if you take a look at the numbers of inventors who move internationally, they move to like Singapore, Switzerland, but mainly to the United States of America. And this isn't because we've got this genius migration policy in Washington. It's just we can't help it. We seem to attract talent from abroad.
Despite ourselves.
One of the problems that we've seen over the last 4 years is that the Biden administration couldn't have done much more than it brilliantly devised to undermine popular support for immigration to the United States through the crisis on the southern border. And in a way, the longest term threat to America's demographic basis for success be undermining the support for legal migration. We have had in the past a near, cease on migration to the U.S. We had that after World War I. So it's not like this can't happen here. And I think that people who are concerned with the success of our society, our economy, and our project for the future should be very intent upon making a success of legal migration to America.
Good luck with that. Donald Trump has some ideas, but I'd like to see them come to fruition first. I mean, it's been really hard. And as you say, there's really a growing consensus against it. So I want to ask you an ideological question. I told my daughter Olivia that we were having you on and about the work that you were doing and summarized it for her. And she said, wasn't that a good thing? There is a substantial cohort that believes that having fewer people on planet Earth is a good thing. What's the counter argument, and why isn't it a good thing?
I think we can. I think we can basically continue to be a prosperous, affluent world with fewer people and an older population. I don't think that's where the glitch is. I mean, if we were all just robots and we're making like fewer robots and the robots last 85 years, we could organize this so that improved productivity would be the order of the day for generations. It's the humanity in us. The problem is that we're not robots, is that we're human beings and we're a social animal that needs other people and needs other relationships. The toughest part, I think, of a world of continuing depopulation will be what happens within family units, which has been the basis of our organization, forever. With increasing numbers of people who are childless or have very few children and an ever more gray world, the fraying of the family network is going to be, I think, a metaphysical problem for humans in the future. Now, I've said we're the most adaptable animal, and I think we are the most adaptable animal. Are we going to be able to figure out a hack for lack of families? Maybe, but it's not obvious to me what that is.
Let's talk a little bit more about I wanted to pivot to something else, but you just hit on something. We talked a little bit about the loneliness epidemic. I think that the low birth rates for young people today are so incredibly short-sighted because they're going to end up without people to love them one day. I can't think of a greater tragedy than to be unloved. And the people who, if you don't have children, your friends, I had an elderly mother who died at the age of 92, and she outlived all of her friends. She was, except for me and her caregiver, she was kind of alone in the world at the end. Who wants to die lonely?
Yeah, well, not humans as we're configured or as we've been divinely created. I mean, it's not in our nature. In a way, the social sciences have very limited ability to provide insight to us on this. We have to look to other places, and you can look either to theological sources, or if that's too difficult, you can read science fiction. And because the science fiction writers, I think, have done a much better job than our experts in trying to explore world that we may come into in depopulation and superaging. Some of the writing is dystopian, some of it is less dystopian, but it's not until we actually explore some of these imagined possibilities that we can kind of like pull ourselves back to the present and think about what sort of world we want to live in, we want our children to live in, we want other people's future progeny to live in.
I mean, just to stick with this theme, I mean, one of the things that you and I actually, and frankly, I and many others have talked about over the decades in public policy has been that America has been above replacement or at replacement for such a long time, an anomaly as other countries were cratering because America was an optimistic country, whereas our friends in Europe are, I don't think anybody would describe them as optimistic. Frankly, I'm not sure I would describe our country anymore as optimistic. You know, we're not Reagan's Morning in America every day anymore. But is that, you know, we're sort of getting into very speculative areas here of spirituality and psychology. But I mean, that is a thing, isn't it? What happens when the vast mass of the world is not optimistic about the future ahead of it?
Well, in our country, and maybe in Europe, it's quite clear that today people who are having relatively more kids tend to be more involved in religion. They tend to be more optimistic. They also tend to be more patriotic. They tend to be proud of their country. It's no secret that we've seen a big drop off in all of those things in the United States over the last decade and a half. You can time it roughly from the financial crisis of '08 or the election of Obama, whichever you prefer. But we've been in sub-replacement world since then, and we've been going further into it with each rising cohort of young prospective parents. I don't know that it has to be that way everywhere, but I mean, it is the way that we see it, so we think of this as the norm. It happens that sub-replacement patterns in the United States are associated with a tangle of attitudes and mores that seem pretty problematic for a healthy society. It's the pessimism, it's the triumph of irony, it's the lack of confidence in your country or in pretty much any other institutions in your society. I don't think that below replacement fertility requires that, but in the real existing world where we are in, kind of Europe and North America, that's what we're seeing now.
I can't prove it, but it strikes me that the root of all this is the secularization of society. You said we have to turn to other things like theology to understand this and find the solutions. You just go back to the book of Genesis, which is the founding text of the monotheistic religions. And God says to Adam and Eve, go forth and multiply. He didn't say go forth and replace yourself. So the biblical standard is 3 or more, right? There was wisdom in that. And to the extent that we have gotten away from taking those things as guiding principles for our societies, whether Muslim, Jewish, Christian, whatever, we get into trouble in lots of ways. And this is the most recent way.
Well, I think it's certainly true that we, at least in the OECD countries, live in such a prosperous world, so much vastly richer and secure and protected than previous generations had experienced, that we've kind of forgotten the existential fear of extermination. I mean, that's not true for our brethren in Israel, but it's true for a lot of affluent societies elsewhere. And that may be part of the dynamic that you're pointing to. I mean, my much better half, Mary Eberstadt, has argued that it was the technological disruption caused by the pill that's precipitated a lot of what we see. And she is always right, so it must be true. I mean, Danny pointed to the smartphone. I think the smartphone may be a turbocharger off of that as well. So we can't ignore the potential role of technology here, although, I can't prove the smartphone thing to you today, though I think it's really important to follow up on that.
Though maybe in Danny's wisdom, the smartphone and desecularization and all these trends are driving us into a culture of self, right? That we are all, this generation is all about themselves. And so children, rather than being the fulfillment and finding your happiness in the happiness of others, they're like an accessory, right? Well, we'll have one. and it won't disrupt our lives too much. We can still go on vacations and we can still do all the fun things that we live in our prosperous society do, but without having the sacrifices. But if I have 2 or 3, oh my gosh, it's going to change my life and I'm going to have to center my life around my kids. And it's short-sighted selfishness.
But this is Mark. This is the trend in surrogacy, right? The rent-a-womb phenomenon is absolutely behind this idea that I have to prioritize my well-being. You hear this. My wellness, my this, my that, and a life dedicated to yourself is not an especially fulfilling one, that's for sure.
Well, we're all parents. 3 of us are all parents, and I think we can attest that children have many, maybe innumerable joys. But one thing that kids are not is convenient. And if you prioritize convenience, I can tell you what that's going to do to a society's birth rate.
Right. Although I will say, I know this will entertain both of you, actually, and maybe this is my final contribution. So I don't know if you remember Nick Dan Loeb, who used to be more involved with AEI. So he, together with a whole bunch of organizations that we all love and respect, have put together this Torah challenge. And it's got a weekly reading of the Torah. And if you are a Sunday school dropout like me, this was actually a really nice thing. So I'm sitting there reading the interpretation of the book of Genesis. And it turns out that Eve does go forth and multiply, but she doesn't go forth. She has 5 children before she leaves the Garden of Eden, before the original sin. But in addition, she has children and has them almost instantaneously. It is the 9 months of waiting and the childbirth and the pain of childbirth that are the punishment that God inflicts on her for sin. So let me just say on behalf of all women, yes, it was better before. This is why people don't have 7 children. It's really hard.
Well, I will say that I have 4 kids. Danny has 4 kids. You were just before we came on talking about your Thanksgiving plan. You have 4 kids and you have grandchildren coming for Thanksgiving. So just for the record, for all of our listeners, we're not the problem. But before we let you go, I want to turn, because we're all in the foreign policy department. Just let's talk just briefly about the foreign policy implications for this. Russia and China are longstanding self-replacement societies. China is about to go into a demographic collapse. It's sort of like the economic and demographic collapse. It's like the car going up the roller coaster that's about to reach the top and start plummeting down. Our colleague Hal Brands has pointed out that this is a moment of peak danger for Taiwan because it's a use it or lose it moment. What are the foreign policy implications for the United States and the national security implications of this whole phenomenon?
Well, I don't know what you call them, the legion of supervillains or the alignment of axis or whatever. Iran, North Korea, Russia, China are all below replacement countries. 2 of them we know are already shrinking. North Korea may well be shrinking as well. The demographic winds are not in their sails. Now, it is true that a country like North Korea, which has a GDP of approximately 0, can cause a lot of trouble. We've seen that for a long time. So a shrinking, aging China, which has the 2nd largest economy in the world run by a revisionist regime, can be a lot of trouble. But I don't think that this means it's going to be a China, Russia, Iran, North Korea future. One thing which we don't know about yet, and this is still in part of the science fiction portion of the program, is what the casualty tolerance is going to be in places like China in the future. I mean, we've got 2 below replacement countries slugging it out on the edge of Europe with Ukraine and Russia, and both the dictatorship and the democracy seem to be willing to suffer grievous casualties. So I don't know if this is the generalization or the exception for the future, but we're going to have a People's Liberation Army made up of only children, basically, in the not too distant future. And what the casualty tolerance will be for that project in relation to foreign expeditions is going to be a terribly important question.
Huge and super interesting. Really, I commend also, by the way, to our listeners, the great work that you did, Nick, on Chinese demographics a few years ago. Yeah, we should update that. Actually, it was hugely important. Hey, thank you as always. So much fun and such a great lesson for us too.
Thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yeah,
Happy
have a wonderful
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving with your enormous family. Thank you on behalf
all
of the
of
American
yours.
people. Thank you, Nick Eberstadt, for populating the world with more Eberstadt
Eberstats.
family members. Because if they're anything like you, we got to have a prosperous future. So, Danny, what do you think?
So you asked the really important question that I can't believe I didn't ask, which is about national security, right? How do we bury one of the leads that's important to our podcast? The implications of this, I think, are hard to imagine. I really liked what Nick said about the fact that it is mostly science fiction writers who've given us a better sense of what the future looks like, rather than social scientists and everybody else. Because if you think about the number of people that the Russians are losing in this feckless war, if you think about the number of people that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, are going to put at risk as they pursue their irredentist plans in Taiwan and elsewhere, they can't really afford to lose those young people. Those are the best and the brightest.
Well, actually, you could make the argument the opposite way, that maybe what China really needs is to put some people into a human meat grinder of war.
That would be true, Mark. That would be true if they were sending old people off to fight.
Yeah.
Because it's those people who are the burden on society. It's the young men and women who are going to sustain that society. And this is one of the reasons why Putin has so avoided a full-scale call-up of Russians, is because he recognizes this.
Yes, well, he's now importing 11,000 North Koreans to fight for him. And the latest report is he's got Yemeni mercenaries coming in as well. So he's turning to other countries to walk into his meat grinder for him. But it's interesting because China is a unique case, because in the West, this is happening by choice, by choices people are making about their lives, by short-sighted choices people are making about their lives. In China, it was a result of government policy, with this one-child policy. And, if you have a situation now in China where it was not just that there was one child, but that everyone was either drowning or sending away for adoption the girl babies. And so you've got a massive male population without prospects of wives. And what do men without prospects of wives do? They like to go to war.
Yeah, but then they die and they don't have
I don't know
children.
if there's a scientific way to prove that, but I would think that a population of males without prospect of marriage is a warlike society, an angry society, an unhappy society that is looking to other solutions to funnel its anger. So, both the demographic collapse and also the psychological impacts of this in China could be very bad for U.S. foreign policy.
All of it is very dangerous. All of this is dangerous. It's dangerous for us too. Look, there's moral hazard here as well. There's a lot to think about, and we're putting this out right before Thanksgiving, so this will give you something to talk about at the dinner table as you think about how to keep your uncle and your mother or your father and your aunt to stop fighting, to stop reenacting their annual Thanksgiving ritual of having a political argument at the dinner table about who voted for Donald Trump. You can talk about demographic decline and why it's bad for us.
I think this podcast is fodder for a lot of grandmothers and grandfathers, or would-be grandmothers and grandfathers, saying, "Where are my grandbabies?" That conversation is going to be happening over Thanksgiving dinner too. When are you going to have children?
There you go.
And good for those parents. Go ask your children. Should play them this podcast and say, "Where are my grandkids?"
That's right. You want to sustain American greatness. Got to have kids.
Amen.
Amen to that. Hey, happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Thank you for being with us. One of the things that Mark and I are really thankful for is the opportunity to come talk to you every week, to have Ben put up with us, and to continue something that's really been a lot of fun and a lot of learning for us.
Take care. See you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.